Topic 7. The Founding and Development of the United States. History GPS. America, from a colony to a world power. In 1492, Columbus discovered America. This began the history of European colonization of the Americas. In the late 18th century, the British 13 colonies started the American Revolution, also known as the American War of Independence, and set up the United States of America, the United States. Since independence, the United States continued to expand its territory westwards and develop. By the late 19th century, it had become a world power. It joined the traditional European powers and played a dominant role on the world stage. Topic Inquiry. How was the United States founded? What were the major internal and external developments of the country after its independence? 1. Founding of the federal country. In 1775, the 13 colonies in North America fought against the British government for their rights. The American Revolution started. The 13 colonies gained independence from Britain. They set up the United States of America and adopted the federal system. 2. Division and reunification. Since the 1820s, there had been disputes between the northern and southern states. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out. Some southern states withdrew from the Federation and set up a new government. The war lasted for 4 years and ended with the victory of the North. The country was reunited. 3. A rising star. After its independence, the United States continued to expand its territories westwards. By the mid-19th century, its frontier had reached the Pacific. Following the end of the Civil War, the United States experienced rapid economic development. Its influence further expanded into South America and Asia as well. It became a rising world power. Facts on the timeline. Britain set up colonies in North America from 1607 to 1733. British people migrated to North America and set up 13 colonies along the east coast. Georgia, the last colony, was set up in 1733. American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. The North American colonies gained independence from Britain through revolution. The United States of America was established. The United States issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The United States did not allow Europe to intervene in American affairs. It showed the determination of the United States to increase its influence in Central and South America. American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. During the war, President Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. The North won the war. It led the United States after reunification. History Starter. 1. The United States is a superpower today, leading the world in economic, technological, and military aspects. It also plays a dominant role in world affairs. 2. With a history of less than 300 years, the United States is a young country. Its birth is related to the history of European colonization of the Americas. 3. Between 1607 and 1733, Britain set up the 13 colonies along the east coast of North America. They were the founding states of the future United States. 4. The North American colonists were discontented with Britain's colonial policies. They started the American Revolution in 1775. The United States of America was established the next year. 5. Stepping into the 19th century, the United States expanded its territories across North America mainly by land purchases, treaties, and wars. It became a large country by area. 6. To develop the vast new Western territories, the government promoted the westward movement. It encouraged people to become pioneers and migrate westwards. The development of the West strengthened the United States. 7. The differences and disputes between the North and South kept increasing. They led to the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. 8. The end of the Civil War put an end to the long-term internal strife in the United States. National unity fostered the rapid development of the country. The United States gradually became a strong power and eventually a superpower as we know today. The internal and external factors and impact of the American Revolution. Guiding questions. What were the internal and external factors of the American Revolution? How did different ideas from Europe bring about the revolution? What impact did the American Revolution have on Europe and the world? 1. Background to the Revolution. During the 17th century and the early 18th century, Britain set up 13 colonies along the east coast of North America. Many British migrated to these colonies in pursuit of wealth and religious freedom. The migrants and their descendants regarded North America as their homeland. In the 1760s and 1770s, British rule over the colonies became increasingly oppressive. With the influence of the Enlightenment ideas, the 13 colonies started the American Revolution to gain independence. Look at the source 7.1. The 13 colonies set up by Britain along the east coast of North America. They were the founding states of the future United States. History in depth. The Puritans and the American Revolution. Puritans seeking religious freedom. In 1607, Britain set up its first colony in North America, Jamestown, in Virginia. In 1620, some Puritans, followers of a Protestant sect, migrated to North America. They were persecuted in Britain, so they sought religious freedom abroad. Puritans becoming colonists. Afterwards, more and more Puritans arrived in North America. By the mid-17th century, there were about 21,000 Puritans in Massachusetts alone. They strove to develop the new continent and kept alive the spirits of liberty and resistance to oppression. Later, Massachusetts became the birthplace of the American Revolution. Look at the source 7.2. An oil painting showing the first Puritans arriving in North America. 2. Causes of the Revolution. A. Political discontent. 1. Autonomy of local councils. After the establishment of the 13 colonies, the North American colonies were allowed to set up local councils. The councils had powers to pass laws, collect taxes, and mobilize militias. They ruled the colonies together with the governors appointed by the British government. As Britain was occupied with its own affairs in the 17th century, it seldom intervened in the autonomy of the North American colonies. Look at the source 7.13. An oil painting of the first local council meeting in North America in 1619. 2. Decrease in autonomous power. Britain dominated North America after 7 years' war from 1756 to 1763. It then started to tighten its governance of the 13 colonies. For example, acts passed by local councils had to be approved by the British Parliament. The British governors could veto resolutions made by local councils and even disband the councils. B. Economic discontent. 1. Trade policy. Britain enforced strict trade regulations on the 13 colonies since the 1760s. For example, the colonists could not produce goods similar to Britain's exported goods. Also, they could only sell their goods to Britain. These regulations hindered the economic development of the 13 colonies. 2. Tax problems. Starting from 1764, the British government passed several acts to tax various goods in the 13 colonies. The colonists refused to pay the taxes, arguing that they did not have representation in the British Parliament. The relations between the colonies and Britain worsened. Look at the source 7.4. The 7 Years' War was a watershed in British policy towards the 13 colonies. 7 Years' War involved the major European powers of the time and was fought in Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. France was defeated by Britain in North America. It ceded vast territories in North America to Britain. The impact on North American colonies. Changes in governance. Before the war, relatively loose, local councils were allowed to share power with governors. After the war, it tighter. Resolutions made by local councils had to be approved by the governors and the British Parliament. Changes in economic policies. Before the war, mainly provided British manufacturing industries with raw materials and products. Colonies were self-sufficient economically. After the war, continued to provide Britain with raw materials and products. New taxes were levied to pay for the British military expenditure. Rigid trade regulations were imposed. C. Influence of the Enlightenment. The works of the European Enlightenment thinkers spread and became very popular in North America. Inspired by the Enlightenment, the colonists realized that they had the right to overthrow an absolute government. Local famous thinkers such as Paine and Jefferson strongly criticized British colonial rule, encouraging more North American colonists to resist British oppression. Look at the source 7.5. The Tax Acts passed by the British government from 1764 to 1767 above, and a painting showing the North American colonists protest against the Stamp Act, left. Look at the source 7.6. Influence of North American Enlightenment thinkers on the development of the American Revolution. The thought of Paine. The British monarch does not safeguard the liberty of the North American colonies. He only brings tyranny and oppression. Paine was one of the founding fathers of the United States. Main Enlightenment ideas. He opposed tyranny, set up a democratic republic. His influence. Published The Common Sense during the American Revolution. It encouraged the North American colonists to fight for independence. He helped with the establishment of a federal republic after the independence of the United States. Thought of Jefferson. When the people fear their government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. Jefferson is a founding leader of the United States, a major author of the Declaration of Independence. His main Enlightenment ideas: natural rights and liberty. His influence. He inspired the North American colonists with the ideas of natural rights and liberty, encouraged them to fight for independence. He included the ideas of liberty and equality in the Declaration of Independence. 3. Course of the Revolution. A. Immediate causes of the Revolution. 1. The Boston Tea Party, 1773. In May 1773, the British government allowed the British East India Company to sell tea in the 13 colonies without paying taxes. This seriously hurt the interests of the North American merchants. They led the North American colonists to boycott British tea. In December 1773, about 100 North American colonists dressed up as American Indians, Native Americans. They boarded the British merchant ships docked at Boston, the capital city of Massachusetts, and threw cargoes of tea into the sea to show their anger at the British government. 2. The Intolerable Acts, 1774. In April 1774, Britain passed the Coercive Acts to strengthen its control on the American colonies. The colonists believed that the acts violated their rights. Therefore, they called these acts the Intolerable Acts. Look at the source 7.7, an oil painting showing the Boston Tea Party on the right. The colonists dressed up as American Indians to show that they were North Americans rather than British colonial citizens. A museum was built over the site where the incident happened. 3. The First Continental Congress, 1774. Representatives from the colonies held the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They sent a petition to British King George III. They demanded that Britain should abolish the Intolerable Acts and give them equal rights with other British people. B. Outbreak and development of the Revolution. 1. Start of the Revolution. Outbreak of the war at Lexington, 1775. In February 1775, Britain planned to regain control of the colonies by force. Later, British troops fought against a colonist militia at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The colonies decided to fight for their rights as response. The American Revolution started. 2. The Declaration of Independence and the Founding of the United States of America, 1776. On July 4, 1776, representatives from the 13 colonies signed the Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed the establishment of the United States of America and the independence of the 13 colonies from Britain. The 13 colonies then became the 13 states. Americans call July 4th the Independence Day and have designed this day as their national day. Look at the source 7.8. A memorial statue of a captain of the Lexington militia. North American colonist militias were also known as Minutemen, as they were ready for military duty at a minute's warning. Look at the source 7.9, an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4, 1776, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states. That all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states they have full power to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. History in focus. The 13 colonies on the road to independence. During the American Revolution, the 13 colonies were not determined to gain independence from Britain until the publication of Paine's Common Sense. With the help of other European countries, the North American colonies successfully set up a new independent country. 1. May 1775. The Second Continental Congress. Representatives from the 13 colonies held the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They reorganized the militias into the Continental Army. Washington was made commander-in-chief of the army. However, they still stated that they were loyal to the British king. 2. January 1776. Publication of the Common Sense. Paine published the Common Sense. It changed the attitude of many colonists. They supported independence from Britain rather than loyalty to the British king. 3. July 4th, 1776. Proclamation of the Declaration of Independence. After the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, the United States of America was officially founded. It was a union of 13 independent states without a central government. 4. February 1778. Franco-American Alliance. France recognized the independence of the United States. They formed an alliance against Britain. Later, the United States got military support from Spain and the Netherlands as well. The regional war became an international war. 5. March 1781. Signing of the Articles of Confederation. The 13 states signed the Articles of Confederation, which agreed to set up a central government with diplomatic and military power. However, it had limited powers. The United States was only a loose confederation at the time. 6. October 1781. Surrender of Britain. The Allied forces, led by Washington, captured Yorktown, the stronghold of the British Army. The British Army surrendered. The British government decided to negotiate with the United States to end the war. 7. September 1783. Signing of the Treaty of Paris. The United States and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and ceded the land east of the Mississippi River to the United States. Britain also withdrew its troops from the United States. The 8-year-long War of Independence ended. Here's a famous saying of Henry, a leader of the American Revolution, at a States Assembly in 1775. "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Think about it. What price was Henry willing to pay for the liberty of the 13 colonies? Data-based question 1. Aim: to understand the influence of the Enlightenment on the American independence movement. Level 2. Interpreting sources and using our knowledge and understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source: Major Arguments in Paine's Common Sense. Europe, and not Britain, is the parent country of America. If Britain was the parent country, it would not attack its children. Britain's motive in dealing with the North American colonies is interest, not attachment. The aim and the meaning of the existence of government is to safeguard the security and freedom of citizens. Unfortunately, the British political system cannot meet this demand. Rulers, including the British monarchs, are not naturally just. The hereditary system limits the choices of later generations. Monarchy and the hereditary system only lead to tyranny and oppression. Under a republican government, the ruler elected and the ruled voters support each other naturally to maintain the common interests. The power of the government is based on mutual support and not a meaningless monarchy. 4. Political system and constitution of the late 18th century United States. A. The Constitution of the United States and the Federal Republic. According to the Constitution of the United States, passed in 1787, the United States became a federal republic. The federal government, central government, handled national defense, diplomacy, foreign trade, and currency. The state governments were responsible for state affairs. B. Presidential system and the separation of powers. The President of the United States was the head of the Republic and was elected by eligible citizens. Washington was the first president. The federal government followed the principle of the separation of powers. Powers were divided between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, enabling the three to check and balance each other. Look at the source 7.10. The structure of the federal government of the United States according to the Constitution of the United States. 1. The executive. Enforce laws. It is led by the President and his cabinet. 2. The legislature. Make laws. Formed by the Senate and the House of Representatives. 3. The judiciary. Interpret laws. Formed by the Supreme Court and courts at different levels. From the source. Study source 7.10. The structure of the federal government was based on the ideas of which Enlightenment thinker? How does this government structure protect the rights of the people? History Decoded. Confederation and Federation. What is the difference between a confederation and a federation? A confederation is a union of sovereign states. Member states retain the right of withdrawal from the union. The German Confederation, 1815 to 1866, was a famous example. A federation is a union of partially self-governing cities, provinces, or states. Whereas the central authority of a confederation is relatively weak, a federation has a strong central government. The United States becoming a federal state. According to the Articles of Confederation in 1781, the 13 states established a central government with limited powers. Independent operations of each state did not favor the overall development of the United States. By 1788, the power of the central government was strengthened by the Constitution of the United States. The states, however, had disputed on whether the country should be a confederation or federation since the 1820s. A civil war was about to begin. Look at the source 7.11. The Great Seal of the United States was officially used in 1782. The 13 five-pointed stars represent the 13 states, and the Latin words mean, out of many, one. C. Passage of the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, known as the Bill of Rights, were ratified in 1791. It protects the rights of Americans, including the right to life, property, and a fair trial, and freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and religion. 5. Impact of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was an important event in modern history. Its significance went beyond a successful revolution or the birth of a new country. It affected not only Britain and the United States, it greatly impacted the governments and political systems of Europe and the world then and thereafter. Look at the source 7.12. The preamble to the Bill of Rights starts with, "We the people of the United States," showing that the bill was established and passed at the will of the people of the United States. A. Promoting revolutionary movements. 1. Spread of revolutionary ideas. The American Revolution put the ideas of the Enlightenment, such as the social contract and liberty, into practice. Its success further illustrated to the world that it was possible to achieve liberty and overthrow oppressive rule through a revolution. 2. Outbreak of revolutions. The American Revolution set off a series of revolutions in other parts of the world. In 1789, the French started that French Revolution to overthrow absolute rule. The Central and South American colonies also revolted against their European colonial rulers and gained independence in the early 19th century. B. Setting an example of liberty and democracy. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights incorporated the ideas of liberty and democracy. The American Republican system and government structure, based on the separation of powers, were followed by many countries. The United States set an example of liberty and democracy. Look at the source 7.13. Since the 19th century, the United States has been an ideal destination for those seeking liberty, equality, and democracy. This photo shows immigrants waiting to enter the United States in the late 19th century. B. Territorial expansion and development of the United States in the 19th century. Guiding questions. How did the United States extend its territory during the 19th century? What was the significance of the 19th century territorial development for the United States? 1. Course of territorial expansion. In the 19th century, the United States had recovered from the American Revolution. It experienced rapid economic development. Its population continued to increase. To meet the growing demand for food and land, the United States continued to expand its territories westwards through land purchases, treaties, and wars. Look at the source 7.14. The present-day United States consists of 50 states, and most of them were established in the 19th century. Let's look at the history of territorial expansion of the United States in the 19th century. 1. The United States in 1800. 2. 1803. Purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. 3. 1819. Acquired Florida by signing a treaty with Spain. 4. 1845. Acquired Texas by signing a treaty with the Republic of Texas. 5. 1846. Acquired the Oregon Territory by signing a treaty with Britain. 6. 1848. Acquired the Mexican Cession after signing a treaty with Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War. 7. 1867. Purchased Alaska from Russia. 8. 1898. Acquired Hawaii by signing a treaty with the Republic of Hawaii. Became the 50th state of the United States in 1959. A. Through land purchase. Acquisition of the Louisiana Territory. In 1800, France seized the Louisiana Territory, including 13 Midwestern states in present-day United States, from Spain. In 1802, American President Jefferson negotiated with France for the purchase of French Louisiana Territory. As France was at war with Britain, it decided to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to finance the war in 1803. This is known as the Louisiana Purchase. The United States paid $15 million for over 2.1 million kilometers square of land. Its territory doubled. B. Through treaty. Acquisition of Florida. Between 1807 and 1814, Spain was at war with France. Many Americans took this chance to migrate to Spanish West Florida. In 1818, the United States sent an army to occupy East Florida. At the end, Spain signed a treaty with the United States in 1819 and ceded Florida, located in present-day southern United States, to the United States. Look at the source 7.15. A statue depicting the signing of the Louisiana Purchase. After acquiring the Louisiana Territory, the United States controlled the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. They played an important part in the U.S. economic development after independence. History Extra. National recognition of Uncle Sam. From 1812 to 1815, the United States was at war with Britain. At the time, Samuel Wilson was a beef supplier to the American troops. His beef barrels were stamped with U.S., an abbreviation for the United States, by the government to show that they were state properties. People joked that U.S. was indeed an abbreviation for Uncle Sam. Over time, Uncle Sam became a well-known figure. He was portrayed as an elderly white man with white hair and a goatee. He wore a star-spangled hat, a tailcoat, and striped trousers. In 1961, the U.S. Congress passed a bill to recognize Uncle Sam as a symbol of the United States. C. New Diplomatic Principles. The Monroe Doctrine. 1. Declaration of the Monroe Doctrine. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the European powers intended to restore their colonial rule in Central and South America. This was unfavorable to the expansion of the United States in the Americas. In 1823, President Monroe proposed a new foreign policy, later known as the Monroe Doctrine. It had three major principles. The United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or wars between European countries. The United States recognized and would not interfere in existing European colonies in the Americas. European countries should respect that the Americas belong to the Americans. They should no longer regard the Americas as subject of colonization. European interference in American affairs would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. 2. Significance for the development of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine was first supported by Britain. Other European countries also accepted it one after another. The doctrine made European countries give up recolonizing the Americas. It also favored future expansion of the United States in Central and South America and its leadership in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine also became the cornerstone of the American foreign policy for almost a century. The United States followed a policy of isolation and did not intervene in affairs outside the Americas. Thus, the United States could focus on expansion in the Americas and its own development. D. Through treaty, acquisition of Texas. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico and established the Republic of Texas. In 1844, the United States signed an agreement with the Republic of Texas. Texas was then admitted into the United States in 1845. Look at the source 7.16. A political cartoon about the Monroe Doctrine. From the source. Study source 7.16. Which country did Uncle Sam in the cartoon represent? What argument did he use to stop European powers from entering the Americas? Look at the source 7.17. Texas militias in 1836, played by modern Texans to commemorate Texas's independence from Mexico. E. Through treaty, acquisition of the Oregon Territory. In 1818, the United States and Britain agreed to rule the Oregon Territory jointly. Later, Britain's support to the Monroe Doctrine further improved Anglo-American relations. In 1846, a treaty was concluded by which the United States obtained the Oregon Territory from Britain. F. Through war and treaty, acquisition of the Mexican Cession. Following its defeat in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, Mexico signed a treaty with the United States. For a sum of $15 million, Mexico ceded a vast region known as the Mexican Cession to the United States. The region included present-day states in southwestern United States such as California and New Mexico. History in depth. American-Mexican border issue after the Mexican-American War. Numerous Mexicans entering the United States illegally. Mexico is adjacent to the United States. From the mid-19th century, many Mexicans had crossed the American-Mexican border and smuggled into the United States for a better life. These Mexican illegals were helped by their friends and relatives living in the American border cities, making the arrest of legal difficult. Besides, American employers were willing to hire them as cheap labor. Therefore, the number of illegal immigrants kept rising. The United States built walls along the border. The United States started building barriers along the American-Mexican border in the late 20th century. However, these barriers were crude and were called walls of shame by the Mexicans. By the early 21st century, disputes over the American-Mexican border issue remain unresolved. G. Through land purchase. Acquisition of Alaska. Faced with internal economic difficulties, Russia decided to sell Alaska to the United States in 1867. The United States purchased more than 1.5 million square kilometers of land at a price of $7.2 million. The American territorial expansion in North America was almost completed after the so-called Alaska Purchase. History headline: Who wants a frozen land? What a bad deal. March 30, 1867. The Alaska Purchase. On March 30, 1867, the United States reached an agreement to purchase Alaska from Russia. According to the treaty, the land price amounted to about $5 per square kilometers. The deal took effect on October 18. This day was designated as the Alaska Day. Was it a bad deal? The purchase was controversial in the United States. Some believed that it was not worth buying the frozen land of ice and snow. They ridiculed Alaska as Seward's icebox, the Secretary of State responsible for the land deal. Nevertheless, the United States soon found out the value of this icebox. Gold and oil were found in Alaska in 1899 and 1968, respectively. Its rich natural resources and tourism have also contributed to the economy of the United States. Seward seemed to have made a far-sighted decision. Age: through treaty and war. Acquisition of overseas territories. By the mid-19th century, territory of the United States had stretched across North America and its population had grown rapidly. The United States then started to expand overseas. In 1898, it obtained Hawaii, located in the Central Pacific Ocean, through treaty. Its modern-day boundaries were largely established. It also gained Guam and the Philippines, located in the Western Pacific Ocean, through war. 2. Territorial development, the westward movement. A. Introduction. The newly acquired western territories of the United States had yet to be developed. The government therefore encouraged people to migrate westwards and pioneer the West. This is known as the westward movement. The westward movement lasted from the late 18th century to early 20th century. A large-scale westward migration of people and development of the western territories took place. At the same time, however, the American Indians were forced to move away from their homelands. History in depth. Manifest Destiny. Since the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, some Americans believed that they were given the continent of North America by God. Journalist O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny in 1845 to describe the essence of this mindset. Americans further supported the idea that they were destined by God to expand across North America. Under the influence of manifest destiny, Americans were keen on carrying the light of civilization westwards, such as superior American system and culture, including Christianity. This idea was an important driving force of the Western movement. Look at the source 7.18. In 1844, Polk won the presidential election as a champion of manifest destiny. He also actively promoted the westward movement during his terms of office from 1845 to 1849. B. Course of territorial development. 1. Continuous westward migration. The federal government sold land in the West to its people since the late 18th century. It set off a tide of large-scale westward migration. In 1862, the federal government passed the Homestead Act, which allowed people to buy land cheaply. It further encouraged westward migration. 2. Land development and building. The pioneers opened up land in the West to build farms and ranches. From the 1840s to 1850s, the mining industry and manufacturing industry arose. Meanwhile, the federal government built many infrastructures in the West. It also carried out policies to encourage private companies to invest. Many roads, canals, and railways were built. 3. Expulsion of American Indians. In 1830, the federal government enacted the Indian Removal Act. The American Indians were expelled from their homelands and enforced to move to the Indian reservations in the West. Many of them died during the migration on wars. Their civilization was also seriously damaged. Look at the source 7.19. An American oil painting depicting the American Indians leaving their homelands in the 1830s. A monument erected on the route of migration of the American Indians to commemorate their Trail of Tears. 3. Impact of the 19th century territorial expansion on the development of the United States. A. Promoting national development. 1. Increase in food production. After years of territorial expansion and westward movement, the Western Territories became a major production region of wheat and pork in the United States in the mid-19th century. They supplied food to the Eastern region as well as Europe. 2. Economic growth. The new infrastructure in the West sped up its process of industrialization and urbanization. Steel, petroleum, and mining industries developed rapidly. In 1869, the first transcontinental railway opened. It linked the central and western regions and the existing railway networks in the east. The domestic passenger and cargo volume in the United States greatly increased. These contributed to the rapid economic growth of the country during 1870s-1890s. Look at the source 7.20. The first transcontinental railway consisted of 3 sections and was completed in 6 years. B. Causing series of racial conflicts. During the westward movement, the Americans occupied the land of the American Indians, fought against and even killed a lot of them. For example, the white Americans went to war with the American Indians 3 times from the 1810s to the 1850s in order to develop Florida. The exploitation and oppression of the American Indians would remain as indelible stain on the history of the United States. C. Causing the American Civil War. Since the 1820s, conflicts between America's northern and southern states increased with the territorial expansion. They disputed over whether the new western states should introduce slavery, such as having African slaves. Their relations worsened, leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in the 1860s. Look at the source 7.21. In the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842, the American government mobilized 30,000 soldiers to attack Indian tribes. The image shows one of the chiefs of the Seminole Indians. History Extra. American bison and guns. Both American bison and guns were related to the American Indians. Guns have great influence on present-day United States as well. American bison. American bison have settled in North America since the prehistoric times. They were a religious symbol of the American Indian tribes and were used to make food, clothes, and tools. However, bison were nearly extinct due to the Americans' commercial hunting and slaughter. The westward movement was hazardous not only to the American Indians, but also to bison and bison-related Indian civilization. Guns. It has been the right of the people to keep and bear arms since the independence of the United States. During the westward movement, the Americans used guns to kill the American Indians. Today, while gun ownership is still legal in the country, it is also blamed for shooting incidents. Gun violence has been a threat to the social security of the United States. Look at the source 7.22. The construction and opening of railways caused the death of many bison. In May 2016, American President Obama designated the bison as the national mammal of the United States. Data-based question 2. Aim: to understand the territorial development and its impact on the United States in the 19th century. Level 3. Interpreting sources and using your own understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source: information about the territorial development of the United States in the 19th century. It was a movement that started in the late 18th century. The slogan "Go West" became popular in the United States. Encouraged by the slogan, many Americans traveled to explore the Western territories. These pioneers were adventurous, hardworking, and physically strong. They built their new homes and careers there. The successes of the pioneers encouraged more Americans to move from the eastern cities to the western territories. This sped up the urbanization and industrialization there. Long railways passed through grasslands and valleys. Towns and factories were developed along the railways. However, during this movement, native people, the American Indians, in the Western territories faced continuous persecution and exploitation. They were forced to give up a lot of fertile lands. History extended. Migrant communities and Chinese laborers in the 19th century. Immigrants pursuing the American dream. The 19th century United States was the dreamland of those seeking liberty and opportunities. The immigration tide continued. As a result, different immigrant communities such as Irish, German, and Chinese communities were formed. Among the immigrants, the Chinese had the hardest lives. Reasons for Chinese immigration. Political reasons. In the 19th century, there was political unrest in China. In contrast, the United States had been relatively peaceful and enjoyed steady growth since the end of the Civil War in 1865. A lot of Chinese were thus attracted to move to the United States. Economic reasons. As there was a shortage of farmlands in the 19th century China, many Chinese decided to find jobs abroad. Gold mines were found in western United States between the 1840s and 1850s. The American government also announced the building of the Central Pacific Railroad later on. More Chinese workers then went to the United States for work. Look at the source 7.23. Chinese workers were hardworking. They were also willing to take on dangerous tasks. For example, when laying rails in the mountainous areas in the West, Chinese workers worked on the cliff face mostly without protection facilities. The life and experience of early Chinese laborers in the United States. Role of Chinese laborers. Chinese workers played an important role in American history as economic promoters. For example, the Central Pacific Railroad, which linked the East and the West of the United States, was built in 4 years with their efforts. Discriminations. Chinese laborers were poorly paid and badly treated. As early as the mid-19th century, a tax bill directed against Chinese workers was passed. Other bills were passed to prohibit Chinese from owning real estates and using public facilities. Anti-Chinese laws. White workers feared that Chinese workers would take away their job opportunities. In the late 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which prohibited Chinese immigration to the United States. It was the first and only federal law that suspended immigration for a specific nationality. Community development. Most Chinese migrants tended to live close to their fellow countrymen. Chinatowns gradually emerged. The Chinese also set up Huiguan to unite the Chinese for better self-protection, such as the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association of San Francisco, founded in 1882. Look at the source 7.24. Chinatown in San Francisco has the longest history in the United States. From the source. What qualities of the Chinese were reflected by these American cartoons of the 1880s? How did these qualities arouse anti-Chinese feeling among the white Americans? Laundry was one of the main jobs of the Chinese in 19th century United States. Chinese provided very cheap services. They would even go to distant places to collect dirty clothes from customers. White Americans mocked Chinese laundry workers for no need for rest and extreme low wages. The cartoon shows that the Chinese on the left worked non-stop and took all the jobs. Young white Americans on the right felt helpless. White Americans were anti-Chinese in the 19th century. One reason was that they worried that and even their children would lose their job. C. The United States before and after the American Civil War. Guiding questions. What factors led to the outbreak of the American Civil War? What was the impact of the American Civil War? What were the major developments of the United States after the Civil War? 1. Outbreak of the American Civil War. A. Background. Differences between the South and the North. From 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War broke out between the northern and southern states. It nearly led to the breakup of the United States. In fact, the North and the South had significant political, economic, and social differences long before the war. 1. Different political values. According to the Constitution of the United States, states had all powers not granted to the federal government. The division of state and federal powers had not been clearly defined at this stage. Thus, disagreements resulted. The North believed that federal power should prevail over state power, and federal laws should be adopted for the nation. The South held the opposite view. It also argued that states had the right to nullify federal laws and even withdraw from the Federation. Different political values became the roots of the conflicts later on. Look at the source 7.25. The division of the South and the North was based on the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line was established in 1776. It was originally the dividing line between Pennsylvania and Maryland. In 1804, the federal government extended the line to divide the northern free states and the southern slave states. 2. Different economic developments. In the first half of the 19th century, industry and commerce in the North developed rapidly. To prevent competition from foreign industrial goods, the North supported protective tariffs. In contrast, the Southern economy highly depended on agriculture and plantations. Its industrial development lagged behind that in the North. The South, therefore, supported free trade in order to import cheap industrial goods from abroad. 3. Different social structures. The society of the North was mainly composed of capitalist class, middle class, and working class. The South was an agricultural society and adopted slavery. It had a lot of black slaves working in the plantations. The society of the North was freer and more open than that in the South. The North valued natural rights as stated in the Constitution more. B. Causes. North-South disputes over major issues. The South and the North had different political values, economic developments, and social structures. These led to their growing disputes over tariffs, slavery, and the Western territories. A civil war eventually broke out. Look at the source 7.26. Black slaves picking cotton in the South in the 1860s. Look at the source 7.27. Cincinnati in Ohio in the early 19th century. Cincinnati was the main industrial town in the North. It had a busy port with many steamships docked along the shore. 1. Disputes over tariffs. Between 1828 and 1832, the federal government introduced protective tariffs on imported industrial goods. The southern states strongly opposed the acts. They feared that foreign countries would introduce revenge tariffs on their agricultural exports. South Carolina even nullified the acts. Although the southern states finally accepted the revised acts, tensions between the South and the North continued. 2. Disputes over slavery. Free states and slave states coexisted since the founding of the United States. Most northern states were free states. They valued natural rights and supported the abolition of slavery. They also hoped that liberated slaves could work at factories. Most southern states were slave states. Slaves acted as a major labor force in southern plantations and even the southern economy. The southern states argued that they had the right to maintain slavery within their borders. The economic and moral controversies aroused by slavery remained unsolved. They further triggered disputes over the Western territories. Look at the source 7.28. The United States upheld liberty, but even some early presidents kept slaves. Abolition of slavery became a struggle between the ideal and reality. This sowed the seeds of the American Civil War. Look at the table of ownership of slaves of American presidents. Washington owned more than 300 black slaves, did not free his slaves when he was alive, freed his slaves in his will. Jefferson owned more than 600 black slaves, did not free his slaves when he was alive, passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 to capture runaway black slaves, freed some of his slaves in his will. Madison owned more than 100 black slaves, freed one slave when he was alive, did not free his slaves in his will. Monroe owned about 50 black slaves, did not free his slaves when he was alive. As comics say, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Main point of the comics. How did Uncle Tom's Cabin intensify the disputes between the South and the North over slavery? 1. In 1850, Mrs. Stowe wrote the Uncle Tom's Cabin. 2. The story tells that Uncle Tom, a black slave, saved Eva, a little white girl, from drowning. Later, he was bought by Eva's father and became a slave in their family. 3. Uncle Tom and Eva became good friends. Unfortunately, Eva and her father died. Uncle Tom was sold to a plantation owner. 4. The new owner treated Uncle Tom badly. Finally, Uncle Tom was beaten to death because he refused to tell where the runaway slaves were. 5. In 1852, the novel was published. The story's anti-slavery message made the calls to end slavery louder in the North. On the other hand, the South criticized the story for vilifying slavery. The disputes between the South and the North over slavery were intensified. 6. In 1861, the American Civil War started. It was said that in the early days of the war, President Lincoln met with Mrs. Stowe and said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." 3. Disputes over the Western territories. Disputes over slavery aroused controversy over Missouri's request for statehood in 1819. The South and the North reached the Missouri Compromise next year. They agreed to establish a dividing line on the new Western territories. Slavery was prohibited in the newly established states north of the line. The territorial disputes, however, persisted during the American expansion in the 1840s. In 1854, the federal government passed a bill. It allowed the new states to decide whether to introduce slavery by popular vote. The Missouri Compromise was repealed, leading to a confrontation between the South and the North. In Kansas, bloody conflicts broke out between 1854 and 1858. Relations between the South and the North quickly worsened. Look at the source 7.29. Between 1820 and 1854, the North and the South disputed over whether the newly acquired Western territories should be free or slave states. Missouri Compromise, 1820. Missouri was located on both the northern and southern sides of the Mason-Dixon Line of 1804. In 1820, the compromise admitted it as a slave state, while Maine was admitted as a free state. A new line divided free and slave regions in the West was also drawn. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. It allowed settlers of Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether to introduce slavery by vote, instead of being free states in accordance with the Missouri Compromise. Pro-slavery groups and anti-slavery groups then rushed to Kansas, causing 4-year-long bloody conflicts. C. Immediate cause. Lincoln elected president. In 1860, Lincoln ran for president. His election manifesto included protective tariffs and restricting the expansion of slavery. He won the election without any support from the southern states. As a result, the southern states withdrew from the Federation in succession. In February 1861, these states formed the Confederate States of America, also known as Confederacy. Lincoln stated that the Confederacy was unconstitutional, but the North-South confrontation continued. Then in April, the American Civil War broke out. Look at the source 7.30. Lincoln was the first Republican president. The Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery and thus was supported by the northern states. Look at the source 7.31. A summary table of the outbreak of the American Civil War. North. Federal power should prevail over state power. Federal laws should be adopted for the whole nation. Economy mainly based on industry and commerce. Society mainly composed of capitalist class, middle class, and working class. A more open and free society. It supported protective tariffs to protect local industries. Supported the abolition of slavery because it was against the spirit of the Constitution and could increase workers at factories. It opposed the spread of slavery to the Western territories. Differences with the South. State power should prevail over federal power. The states could nullify federal laws and even withdraw from the Federation. Economy mainly based on agriculture. Agricultural society and adopted slavery. It supported low tariffs, feared the foreign countries would slap revenge tariffs on their agricultural exports. It supported slavery in their states to maintain the southern plantations and economy. It supported extending slavery to the Western territories. Conflicts between the North and the South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, repealed the Missouri Compromise. This led to bloody conflicts in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. Relations between the North and the South quickly worsened. Immediate cause. Lincoln ran for president in 1860. The southern states did not support his election manifesto. After Lincoln won the election, the southern states withdrew from the Federation and formed the Confederate States of America. The American Civil War broke out in April 1861. History in focus. A tragic civil war. Owing to their differences, relations between the South and the North remained hostile after the 1820s. In less than a century after the independence of the United States, the 4-year-long American Civil War broke out. It killed more than 600,000 people, much more than the casualties of the American Revolution. 1. April 1861. The Battle of Fort Sumter. In March 1861, Lincoln was sworn in as a president. On April 12, the Confederate States Army bombarded the United States Army at Fort Sumter. The American Civil War started. 2. May 1861. The Anaconda Plan. The United States Army adopted the Anaconda Plan to blockade the harbors of the South to weaken its economy. The plan succeeded. 3. August 1862. Crisis of the United States Army. The Confederate States Army, led by General Robert Lee, defeated the United States Army and marched towards Washington, the capital of the Federation. France and Britain tended to support the Confederate States Army. 4. January 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln officially issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which announced the liberation of slaves in the Confederacy. Thousands of slaves fled to the North. Other countries decided not to support the South due to domestic opposition. 5. July 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg. In July 1863, the Confederate States Army suffered heavy casualties in the Battle of Gettysburg. This was the turning point of the Civil War. 6. September 1864. Counterattack of the United States Army. In September 1864, the United States Army captured Atlanta, a stronghold in the South. It marched towards Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. 7. May 1865. The end of the Civil War. In early 1865, many southern states had been occupied. In April, General Lee's troops were forced to surrender to the United States Army. In May, the Confederate States Army surrendered. The Civil War ended. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It was an address given by Lincoln in 1858. Think about it. To what did the house in the speech refer? Why did it divide into two? Data-based question 3. Aim: to understand the relations between the emancipation of black slaves and the American Civil War. Level 2. Interpreting sources. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source: important events in the emancipation of black slaves and the American Civil War. February 1861. Southern states withdrew from the Federation and founded the Confederacy. March 1861. Lincoln stated that the South could keep slavery and stressed the importance of national unity. Anti-slavery leaders criticized Lincoln as an excellent slave hound. April 1861. The American Civil War began. The United States Army was in a less favorable position. August 1862. In a letter to a newspaper, Lincoln wrote, "My paramount object is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." January 1863. Lincoln officially issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederacy. Impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. It ended the hope of the Confederacy of getting foreign recognition, especially Britain. Within 2 years after the proclamation, numerous slaves fled from the South to the North. About 90,000 of them joined the United States Army. The plantation economy of the South collapsed. 2. Results and impact of the American Civil War. A. Results of the Civil War. The 4-year-long American Civil War cost about 600,000 lives and $15 billion. The nation was reunified under the leadership of the North. Slavery was abolished after the war. The South was placed under military control. Reconstruction started. All the southern states were readmitted to the Federation in 1870. B. Impact of the Civil War on the development of the United States. 1. Political aspect. Promoted national unity. Before the American Civil War, the power of the federal government was limited. During the war, the North dominated the federal government. It unified national banking and currency system. It also abolished slavery. After the American Civil War, the federal government was strengthened. Wartime policies were adopted across the country. National unity promoted the development of the reunified United States. History Extra. How did the war unify the currency system? In 1792, the United States adopted the US dollar as the national currency. However, there were no banking and currency regulations. In every state, private banks could issue their own currencies. British, French, and Spanish silver coins were also widely circulated. The currency system was chaotic. When the American Civil War broke out, the federal government introduced measures to raise money for the war. It established national banks, which were placed under government control, and authorized them to issue a uniform currency. These measures improved the banking and currency systems. They not only alleviated the cash shortage of the North during the war, but also favored the rapid economic development of the United States after the war. Look at the source 7.32. A $1 note issued by one of the national banks in 1869. The portrait of President Washington was shown on the front of the note. 2. Economic aspect. Laid the foundation for economic development. Before the Civil War, industrial development was not supported by the South. During the war, the North introduced measures to encourage economic development. It subsidized private companies to build railways, especially those connected to the Western territories. Introduced highly protective tariffs to protect local industries. Introduced the Homestead Act to encourage people to open up farms in the West. After the war, these measures were carried out nationally. These fostered the development of the West. It also laid the foundation for the rapid industrialization of the United States from the 1870s to 1890s. 3. Social aspect. Moved towards racial justice. Slavery violated natural rights as stated in the Constitution of the United States. During the war, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South. Amendments to the Constitution were further made in the post-war period. They abolished slavery and granted black people citizenship and voting rights. This was an important step towards racial justice and equal rights. Look at the source 7.33. Railways became an important national construction project after the war. Railways linked many states together. They drove the development of the iron and steel, coal and transport industries. 3. Important developments after the American Civil War. A. Reconstruction and development of the South. 1. A decade-long reconstruction of the South from 1867 to 1877. Reconstruction of the South means the course of restoring the order of the South. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts. To be readmitted into the Federation, they were required to draft a new state constitution and establish new state governments. In 1877, federal troops left the South. The Reconstruction of the South ended. 2. Racial discrimination and segregation. After the war, white Southerners' discrimination against black people continued. Racist organizations were founded. The Southern states passed the Jim Crow laws to enforce racial segregation, including the prohibition of interracial marriage and provision of public facilities for white people. Look at the source 7.34. A painting showing white people from one of the southern states setting fire to houses of black people in 1866. Look at the source 7.35. Relations between white people and black people before and after the American Civil War. Racism did not end with the war. History in depth. The road to equal rights of Black Americans. Black Americans after the war. The post-war amendments to the Constitution guaranteed equality, liberty, and the right to vote to all citizens, including black people. However, Black Americans did not enjoy equal rights and status after the war. In the South, racial segregation was enforced by laws. In the North, racial discrimination was also serious. This situation generated the civil rights movement. The road to equality. In the 1950s and 1960s, Martin Luther King was the most famous leader of the centuries-long civil rights movement. The Congress finally passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outweighed all racial discrimination and segregation measures. Since then, the federal government spent more resources on improving the education and the welfare of black people. More influential black figures emerged. Look at the source 7.36. In 1963, King made the famous I Have a Dream speech, telling his dreams and visions, blacks and whites living together peacefully. B. Rapid industrialization. After the American Civil War, the United States underwent rapid industrialization. It became one of the economic powers in the world. 1. Rapid industrial growth. During the Civil War, federal economic measures stimulated industrial growth in the West and the North. The abolition of slavery after the Civil War also fostered industrial development in the South. Between 1870 and 1899, industry replaced agriculture as the dominant sector of the national economy. In 1900, American industrial production ranked first in the world. The United States became the leading industrial power. 2. Rise of new industries. Before the war, American industrial production was mainly based on light industries. After the war, new heavy industries developed rapidly. The shares of steel, railway, and new energy, such as oil and electricity production, in industrial production increased continuously. 3. Research and development of technological innovations. Starting from 1870s, many new discoveries and inventions were made in the United States. The invention of electric power transmission started the age of electricity in the country. The use of assembly line extended from the food processing industry to other industries. It became an essential part of modern industrial production. 4. Emergence of new business model. New business model developed rapidly since the 1870s. American entrepreneurs conducted mergers and acquisitions and then became monopolies. Some evolved into multinational corporations. For example, soon after its establishment in 1870, Standard Oil grew into the world's largest oil corporation through mergers and acquisitions. Look at the source 7.37. Shares of world industrial production by major Western countries in 1860, 1880, and 1900. From the source. Study the source 7.37. What was the trend of share of the United States in the world industrial production between 1860 and 1900? Look at the source 7.38. Tesla contributed greatly to the development of electricity and industry in the United States. He had more than 200 patents related with electricity. C. Rise to world power. 1. Establishment of military superiority. From 1880 to 1899, the United States actively expanded its navy. It built a modern fleet and reinforced naval training. In 1899, the American Navy was just behind those of Britain, France, and Russia. The military superiority of the United States was gradually established. 2. Increase in global influence. In 1898, the United States won the Spanish-American War. It gained control of Cuba and the Caribbean Sea. It also annexed Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. The American influence had expanded to Central America and the Pacific region. In 1899, the United States announced the open door policy to secure its interests in China. The policy was not opposed by any powers, showing the recognition of the United States' international position and its growing global influence. Look at the source 7.39. Mahan was a famous American naval expert. His theory of sea power affected the military and diplomatic developments of the United States in the late 19th century. Main ideas of Mahan's theory of sea power. Sea routes could bring a lot of commercial interests and prevent a country from fighting a war on its own soil. A country, therefore, should have a strong navy. The US should build a strong navy. Firstly, it should control the Caribbean Sea and waters near Central America. Then, it should struggle with other powers for overseas colonial interests. Look at the source 7.40. A British cartoon about the growth of the United States, published in 1899. From the source. Study source 7.40. How did the cartoon portray the growth of the United States from 1783 to 1899? Concept consolidation. Britain set up 13 colonies in North America, the 17th, early 18th centuries. The causes for that was political and economic discontent and influence of the Enlightenment. It led to the American Revolution from 1775 and 1783. The American Revolution promoted revolutionary movements and settled an example of liberty and democracy. The political system and constitution of the late 18th century United States. It was characterized by the making of the Constitution of the United States and Federal Republic, presidential system and separation of powers, passage of the Bill of Rights. It had unclear division of powers between the federal and state governments, plus the differences between the South and the North. The South and the North disputed over the Western territories, and the territorial expansion and development in the 19th century was characterized by next. Course of territorial expansion. Established modern boundaries through land purchases, treaties, and wars. New diplomatic principles, the Monroe Doctrine. Territorial development, westward movement. Continuous westward immigration, land development and building, expulsion of American Indians. Impact of territorial expansion on the development of the United States. Promoting national development, causing series of racial conflicts, and causing the American Civil War. American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. The background to it was differences between the South and the North, different political values, economic developments, and social structures. The causes: disputes between the South and the North, disputes over tariffs, slavery, and the Western territories. Immediate cause of the war: that Lincoln elected as president in 1860. The results and impact of the American Civil War were next. Defeat of the South. The United States was reunified under the North. Political impact promoted national unity. Economic impact laid the foundation for economic development. Social impact moved towards racial justice. Important developments after the American Civil War. Reconstruction and development of the South. Rapid industrialization. Rise to world power. A global outlook. Let's look at the timeline of events. Early 18th century. Britain set up 13 colonies in North America. 1764. Britain started to tax various goods in the 13 colonies. 1773. The Boston Tea Party. 1774. Britain passed the Coercive Acts. 1775. The American Revolution started. 1776. The proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, founding of the U.S. 1783. The U.S. and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. The American Revolution ended. 1787. The Constitution of the United States was passed. 1791. The Bill of Rights was ratified. 1803. The U.S. purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. 1819. The U.S. acquired Florida by signing a treaty with Spain. 1820. The U.S. passed the Missouri Compromise. 1823. The U.S. proposed the Monroe Doctrine. 1830. The U.S. enacted the Indian Removal Act. 1845. The U.S. acquired Texas by signing an agreement with the Republic of Texas. 1846. The U.S. acquired the Oregon Territory by signing the treaty with Britain. 1848. The U.S. acquired the Mexican Cession after its victory in the Mexican-American War. 1854. The U.S. passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 1860. Lincoln elected president. 1861. The American Southern states formed the Confederacy. The American Civil War began. 1862. The U.S. passed the Homestead Act. 1865. The Confederate States Army surrendered. The American Civil War ended. 1867. The U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. 1877. Federal troops left the South. The Reconstruction of the South ended. Neighbor of the U.S. Canada. Canada is located in North America and borders the United States. Originally a French colony, Canada was ceded to Britain in 1763. In 1867, Canadian Confederation was founded and gained more autonomy. Since then, Canada had expanded westwards. Its power increased continuously. In 1982, Canada became an independent country. As a member of the British Commonwealth, Canada accepts the British monarch as a ruler in a name.